All right, welcome to another deep dive into some fascinating source material. As always, thank you to everyone out there for sending in your recommendations. I think we got some really good stuff for this one.
Yeah.
So today we're looking at the rise of Marxist thought in Latin America.
Okay.
And how that kind of contrasted with positivism, which was really dominant in the 19th and early 20th centuries there.
Right. It's really interesting how long that sort of that positivist ideal really held on.
Yeah.
Emphasizing science and reason, order, progress.
Yeah, and it, in some ways it makes sense, right? Like, these are new nations, right? They're looking to establish themselves. They're looking to kind of find their way forward, and they see, like, okay, well, Europe's doing this whole science and reason thing, and look where they are, right?
Right.
So maybe that's the path forward.
Yeah, and you see it right on the Brazilian flag, Ordem e Progresso, the order in progress.
Exactly, right there for everyone to see. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's these leaders were really looking to that as the model for how to modernize.
Yeah, but at the same time, like you said, you have this focus on order, but underneath that, you've got these deep social inequalities.
Yeah, that's the real interesting kind of tension there.
Yeah.
By the late 19th to early 20th centuries, you have economies that are really based on these raw material exports.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's created these huge social divides. You have a growing urban working class.
Yeah.
And a lot of these governments were really kind of authoritarian in nature.
It really seems like it was just sort of ripe for new ideas, just like a breeding ground for people to say, like, wait a minute, this isn't working, something needs to change.
Right.
So how does Marxism enter this picture? How does it actually arrive in Latin America?
Well, it's interesting. You have European immigrants, right? Yeah. And they're coming. A lot of them are involved in the labor movement in Europe, and they bring those ideas with them. And crucially, you start to get these translations of these key Marxist texts, like the Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, into Spanish.
Yeah.
And so now it's reaching a wider audience of people who are maybe already dissatisfied or looking for something different.
Right. So you have these European ideas, but how do they start to kind of take root in the local context?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. Who are some of these figures?
Yeah.
Jose Carlos Mariátegui in Peru.
Yeah.
He's a really central figure.
Okay.
And he writes this book, 7 Interpretive Essays on Peruvian Reality. And it's really unique because he's taking these Marxist ideas, right? But he's applying them to the specific social and cultural landscape of Latin America.
Okay, so not just like a copy and paste from Europe.
No, not at all. And in particular, he focuses on the role and the history of indigenous communities.
Right.
He's saying that, we need a socialism that's authentically Latin American.
Okay, that's really interesting. So what about other countries, like Argentina? What's going on there?
Yeah, so in Argentina, you have Juan Bautista Justo, and he's really pivotal. He actually undertakes the first Spanish translation of Das Kapital.
Yeah.
Directly from German.
Wow.
And he also founded the Argentine Socialist Party, so he's really bringing these ideas into the local intellectual and political scene.
Yeah, and then you have, on the world stage, you have the Russian Revolution happening, right? So how does that impact things in Latin America?
Huge impact, right? 1917, the Russian Revolution, it's a success.
Right.
At least.
Yeah.
It seems like a success. At the time, they've overthrown this old order. And it really resonates in Latin America. You see these communist parties start to form in the late teens, early 20s, all over the place. Argentina, Mexico, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil. And the Comintern, the Communist International, is offering guidance.
Okay, so there's some sort of top-down coordination going on?
Yeah, to some degree, though there's also a lot of disagreements and debates within those communist movements.
Right, okay, so you have these parties forming, these ideas are spreading. How is this actually playing out in movements on the ground?
Well, you see, it really has a broad impact. For one, labor unions are using this Marxist analysis of capitalist exploitation to really organize. They're organizing strikes. They're forming these national confederations. You also have peasant movements, and they're informed by these Marxist critiques of land ownership, and they're pushing for agrarian reform. And people like Mariátegui are really linking this to indigenous land rights.
That's fascinating. So this is really taking root all across Latin America.
Yeah, and it goes even further. student movements, intellectual movements, are adopting things like Marxist critical theory, influencing university reforms, even artistic expression.
Wow.
And then you also see this really fascinating intersection with liberation theology, which is using this Marxist social analysis to really try to understand and address poverty and injustice.
So you have this really powerful movement of ideas and activism happening. How are the powers that be, how are they reacting to this?
Well, the Cold War is the big backdrop here.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. is operating under this doctrine of national security, and they see Marxism as a major threat.
Yeah.
And this leads to numerous U.S.-backed military interventions against governments and movements that are perceived as Marxist or socialist.
Right, so anything that's seen as like a threat to U.S. interests, basically.
Exactly. I mean, this idea that, capitalism is bad, imperialism is bad, this is a fundamental challenge to U.S. interests.
And that obviously has huge repercussions.
Absolutely,
for Latin America.
You see repression, you see activists and intellectuals being forced into exile.
Yeah.
And tragically, you also see the rise of these Marxist-inspired guerrilla movements.
Right, so it's a very complicated picture. But if we could kind of step back a little bit and look at the core ideas of Marxism, what were the specific aspects that really resonated within Latin America's context?
Yeah, well, there's a few key things. You have this idea of materialist history, right? This idea that material conditions really shape society. And that offered a way to understand Latin American history through its economic structures and class relations.
Okay.
You also have a theory of surplus value, this idea that workers are creating more value than they're paid. And that really helped explain the economic inequality that was so prevalent.
Yeah.
Then you also have this concept of class struggle, which gave people a framework for understanding social and political conflict. And then finally, this idea of dependency theory, which analyzes how these global power dynamics lead to underdevelopment. That really resonated with Latin America's experience as well.
So it's almost like this perfect storm of ideas that kind of came together at the right time in the right place.
Yeah.
So can we trace a very quick chronological development of Marxist influence in Latin America?
Yeah. So very briefly, late 19th, early 20th century, you have this kind of initial arrival and organization. Then from the 1930s to the 1950s, you see further development, more political activity. 1959, the Cuban Revolution really marks a turning point. And then from there to about 2000, you have this rise of guerrilla movements, but also these military interventions. And then from 2000 to the present, you have what's often called the pink tide and these ongoing debates about the legacy of Marxism.
So to kind of wrap all this up, what's the lasting significance of Marxist philosophy in Latin America?
I think it's profound. It really offered this crucial, critical perspective on the social inequalities.
Yeah.
That positivism, that earlier dominant philosophy, often ignored.
Right.
They were so focused on order and progress. But Marxism is saying, hey, wait a minute, what about the people to the bottom?
Yeah.
What about these injustices? And it was adapted, by thinkers like Mariátegui to really fit the local realities.
Yeah.
And it profoundly shaped so many social movements.
Yeah.
And it still remains this vital tool for analysis and a source of inspiration, even after facing periods of intense opposition.
Yeah, so for everyone listening out there, thinking about these two philosophies, positivism and Marxism, how do they continue to shape political debates and social movements in Latin America today? What parts of those critiques still resonate, and where might they fall short in addressing those contemporary realities? It's definitely a lot to think about. As always, thank you for joining us for another deep dive, and we'll see you next time.